Let me start by congratulating the organizers who are also making good use of us, because we are basically doing, for the moment, 3 events at the same time, if I understood this correctly. And that's wonderful. Please allow me to share first, before we go to a stellar panel for the launch of a stellar book, allow me to share first with you a couple of thoughts on the contribution of our Reconnect project to democracy and the rule of law in Europe. I'm very honored that I can be the overall coordinator of this immense project. As you know, Reconnect is an acronym. It stands for Reconciling Europe with its Citizens through Democracy and Rule of Law. 4-year multidisciplinary Horizon 2020 research project where we basically want to understand and provide solutions to challenges faced by the European Union, with an explicit focus strengthening the EU's legitimacy through democracy and the rule of law. We started already long ago, 1st of May 2018. The world was a different place. Europe was a different place. But let me first maybe just very briefly say why we think Reconnect matters in these contributions for rule of law and democracy in Europe. When we wrote the project back in 2017, we basically made a rather dramatic premise, namely that there is an existential crisis of trust between the EU and its citizens, and that if the Union wants to survive and ensure itself of a durable nature and future, the crisis must be overcome. Of course, why should there be a crisis between the Union and its citizens? It has to do with many, many things. Successive crises in which the EU has not been able to convince its citizens that it offered efficient and just and fair solutions, going from the financial crisis, 2008, the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone, the migration crisis, the security crisis relating to terrorist attacks, Brexit, COVID-19, and I should add the backsliding in terms of democratic quality and rule of law in various member states. And so the essential question of our project is, how can the EU reconnect with its citizens? And our working hypothesis until now is that if that is to happen, the Union should give proof that it is serious about upholding the fundamental values which are listed in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. For us, this is essentially the social contract between the EU and its citizens. And if the EU cannot put in practice the values upon which it has been founded, including democracy, the rule of law, human dignity, human rights, justice, solidarity, pluralism, and tolerance, non-discrimination and equality between women and men, and if it is not able to make sure that its member states respect those values, we have a serious problem. And I should recall, and sorry, I'm a lawyer, we always look at the law. I know some colleagues in different disciplines say you shouldn't look at the treaties, but I tend to still do that. So I should recall that Article 2 explicitly states that those values which I've just mentioned are common to the member states. More than that, according to another treaty provision, Article 49, the member states, when acceding to the Union, have both committed to respect and to promote these values. So these values, as Article 2 says, are common to the member states. It doesn't say they should or they will become common to the member states. So in that sense, it was quite remarkable to read a couple of months ago on the website of a prime minister that, and I quote, "there is no unity of values in the EU," and I quote, "and that liberals must respect the rights of non-liberals." The prime minister did not comment on where and how there can be mutual trust between member states if that is not the case. And if there cannot be mutual trust between the member states, how can there be trust of the citizens in the Union? So let me now quickly address how Reconnect contributes, we think, to democracy and rule of law in Europe. First of all, the obvious, I want to stress that we view democracy and the rule of law as inseparable and intertwined. It comes back in quite a number of our recent research reports, which you all find on the Reconnect website. But the quality of democracy can simply not be evaluated without considering the rule of law and vice versa. They can no longer act as legitimizing forces if they are not conducive also to solidarity, justice, pluralism, and so on, especially in times of the contestation of European authority and legitimacy. Allow me first to share a couple of points, maybe 5, maybe 6, but probably time will not be on my side, with regard to our insights and findings regarding democracy. I think that's befitting a conference on probing democracy, of which we are now in the last, session. The democracy-related research of Reconnect has yielded important insights, not just on the global context in which Europe is also operating, where we have seen a worldwide contestation and decreased commitment to democracy over the last years, which impact upon the EU. We have also obtained a number of significant insights. First of all, while we know that democracy is one of the fundamental values of the EU, our research has shown that there are really significant variations in the quality of national democracies within the Union. We have seen a number of member states where democracy has been on a steep downward trend for several years. Secondly, the transfer of ever broader powers to the European Union seems to result in quite a number of countries that they are openly expressing their proclivity towards regaining and strengthening their national sovereignty and identity, including their so-called constitutional identity. In that sense, we couldn't have a more timely workshop since yesterday's ruling of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal. Third point, one of the most worrying aspects in the decline of democracy in the EU, which we found, is what we call the deterioration in the quality of public discourse. I could develop on that, but we don't have time. But the quality of public discourse is specifically influenced by failures to adequately explain actions to European citizens, as well as by the way in which political opponents are portrayed, not as democratic competitors, but as enemies or illegitimate rivals. Fourth point, the crisis of trust that has emerged between the EU and its citizens has manifested itself in multiple ways, and one of these, and we think arguably the most worrying one, is the withdrawal from public participation in the democratic processes. We have analyzed several factors that affect electoral turnout, both at the national and the union levels, but we know, of course, that until now, electoral turnout in European elections is always lower than turnout on national legislative elections. And as we have also found, and that's also published in another book of last year with our Viennese colleagues, we still see that European Parliament elections remain so-called second-order to national elections. Voters mainly vote on the basis of national concerns. All issues on which we could develop, but I'm not going to do that. I come to a fifth point. Another citizen survey was performed by Reconnect in September and October 2020, in which 12,000 citizens in 6 EU member states were consulted. And it gave us lots of interesting insights about the whole setting of the EU in the mind of European citizens. Too much, in fact, to recall, but drawing on those data, we came to the following findings. First of all, EU reform. How do citizens think about EU reform? Citizens are divided. They are divided over the prospect of transferring additional powers to the European level, but also on the prospect of possibly repatriating sovereignty back to the national level. And going a little bit further, we also see that there is a relatively strong, say, preference of citizens for what I would call a status quo with regard to the current distribution of powers between the EU and its member states. But what is very clear, citizens overwhelmingly see that there is still lots of room for improvement of people's acceptance of EU decisions. So the data reveal widespread support for more citizen participation and more transparency of EU decision-making processes. And citizens also place great importance on the capacity of EU policies to solve problems. And they appreciate also that benefits are equally shared among member states. You could say lots of divisions, but also some very, very interesting, say, clear tendencies coming from that. I think this is really, very relevant, not just for all of us, but also for the Conference on the Future of Europe. And to be honest, I've just participated in one of the citizens panels of the Conference on the Future of Europe. I'm not sure if we are able to discuss this issue further here today or tomorrow, But I was initially a bit skeptical, and I must say I found it an interesting experience. And I even wondered to some extent whether we should just have this as something ad hoc or maybe of a more permanent structural feature of, say, the whole way in which the EU deals with decision making. I come very, very quickly to the end, and that is the second part, which is actually on the rule of law, at least as important, of course, in our Reconnect project. And we do have eminent speakers and organizers, I should say, at today's workshop. So now we basically get a little bit into the workshop matter, returning to the rule of law. 3 points, just 3 points. First of all, we've done away at Reconnect with the allegation that the rule of law is a so-called vague and arbitrary concept. Reconnect research has addressed all the key questions regarding the meaning, the scope of the rule of law in the EU context. And we have come to the conclusion that the rule of law should be considered a core and consensual element of Europe's legal space. It's one of the few overarching constitutional principles at the basis of all legal systems in Europe. So when certain member states are attacking the legality of the EU conditionality regulation before the European Court of Justice and argue that there is no EU concept of the rule of law and that it's not even within the Union's jurisdiction, we really have a problem. So, main first finding. Second, we also have found that, in fact, the most pressing current topical issues about the rule of law are not conceptual in nature, but practical in nature. It is about upholding the respect of this principle at all levels where public authority is exercised, be it national or European. And this is why, indeed, Reconnect has carefully examined and identified what can be considered as so-called best practices of the rule of law. It's all very nuanced, divided in a number of categories and so on. I wish I could elaborate, but I won't do it in the interest of time. A last point, third way in which Reconnect as a project, I think, matters for the rule of law is that we have also examined in detail the question of the so-called rule of law toolbox of the European Union. And maybe it will not surprise you, but one of our main findings is that there is actually no need to reinvent the wheel. And that existing instruments, especially now that we have the EU conditionality regulation, are fairly adequate to uphold the rule of law in the EU and its member states if used wisely and efficiently. All of these things beg for further nuances and deepening of the debate, but I'm sure this will happen at this rule of law workshop of today. And so with these illustrations, I hope I was able to make clear to you today that the Reconnect research matters and that it hopefully also contributes to democracy and the rule of law in Europe. And I'm sure that in the 2 days that we will be together in this workshop on the rule of law, our colleagues will elaborate on it, especially our Reconnect colleagues, and that we will have very enriching discussions. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And now I'm going to change hats and become the chair or moderator, whatever you want to call, of this stellar panel that is going to do the launch of a stellar book, the great book, Ruling by Cheating, Governance in Illiberal Democracy by András, Sajó. We have just a stellar lineup of participants. You see them all here with the exception of one distinguished participant who is participating online. You probably have the bios in your documentation, so I'm not going to bore you with trying to even give an impression of their incredible, say, expertise and experience. But let me just say how we will handle this panel. I would propose that we give the floor first to the author, because that seems to me the natural thing to do, that every speaker gets 10 minutes, more or less. After the first presentation, we go to Professor Günter Frankenberg from the Johann Wolfgang Goethe-Universität. Then we ask Michał Matlak of the Review of Democracy. Then we have Julie Smith, Professor Julie Smith, Baroness Smith of Newnham, I should also say, from Cambridge University. And then we have our distinguished online participant Maciej Taborowski from Warsaw University and Deputy Ombudsman of Poland. So with that, I think we should be able to fill the next 50 minutes well. I would, of course, like to give the floor again at the end of the panel to the author, András Sajo, for exercising his fundamental right of reply. So, without any further ado, I first invite Mr. Sajo to the floor. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm really honored to have this nice audience, and the only way to reciprocate the kindness of your presence, I show you the book which I just received. I hope, yeah, that's the book. So that's the privilege of being present. Sorry that it was not made available by the publisher. Now, because of difficulties of obtaining copies, which is in itself not a bad sign of the importance of a work, I would like to use the opportunity to mention very briefly what this book intended to do. It is about illiberal democracies, and I deliberately tried to avoid taking a side in this debate, whether it's competitive authoritarianism or what's not. I know that for scholarly purposes, it's very important to have the proper category, but I thought I'm perhaps more interested in how the animal behaves and less about the categorization, which of course is very important for a curator of a museum. But at the moment, this is alive and well. And by liberal democracy, I try to discuss regimes which mostly came out from populist movements, but not necessarily continue on a populist track. And there are exceptions like Singapore, which is a really good illiberal democracy, but the system was established without anything resembling populism. I think that for those who would like to classify it, the best way to deal with illiberal democracy is, especially those in let's say, from Venezuela to Poland, is to place it in the group of plebiscitarian leader democracies, which can be justified, according to Max Weber, in the circumstances of 1918, when there were some inherent habits of respecting the Kaiser. But Max Weber was also aware of the fact that a plebiscitarian regime may go in the wrong direction when checks and balances disappear. By the way, his model for plebiscitarian leader democracy was England and the Parliament of England. And he said, okay, the prime minister is a plebiscitarian leader, but he is well controlled by parliament. So that was the way to support the idea of plebiscitarian leader democracy. Now, on top of that, we have the liberal element. But the liberal element, I think, is something that is inherent in most established, solid constitutional regimes. We don't like to discuss that. But illiberalism is inherent because of historical compromises and also because the electorate is to a considerable extent illiberal, and not only in Eastern Europe. And by the way, this is, you expect me to deal with Eastern Europe, and I try to do that to some extent, or East Central Europe. Again, I emphasize that many of the observations originate from Latin America. But I think the interesting thing about Eastern Europe is that it is a mirror of Western democracies. And the problem is that by this artificial separation, this Manichaean perception of the world, that, okay, here are solid, robust democracies committed to constitutional order, and here you have those c'est pays là-bas, as the French love to say, those entities over there, and then you immediately confuse Bucharest and Budapest. But what's the difference? Except the European Union, which believes that Bucharest or Romania is not as bad as Hungary or Poland, but leave that aside. So the problem is that this Manichaean division denies the possibility for the West to recognize itself, its shortcomings in the mirror of the West. And they are drifting towards what is happening here. And they don't want to admit that because we are different. The book is about continuities. The book is about the way, in the context of elections, in the context of the making and application of the rule of law, these countries cheat, but they cheat using exactly those elements which do exist in the West. I mean, gerrymandering was not invented in Hungary. And if you look at Hungarian electoral boroughs, districting, okay, it's not that bad compared to the discrepancies you will see in a number of countries, which of course I am not in the position to name. There are other techniques in Hungary or Poland or many other countries, which again distort electoral democracy. It's undeniable. And I'm not saying that these are identical, the Western fallible backlashing democracies and what became a system building on all those inventions and shortcomings that exist in a liberal democracy. But remember that what was used in one context can be used in a different one. And I just try to describe those specific techniques and tricks which are used in order to turn these shortcomings into a systemic and systematic regime. The regime is very different because it cannot be easily changed. And that's certainly something that makes it different, fundamentally different from established democracies at the moment. As I have another 2 minutes, I have to make use of the opportunity to refer to my favorite quote to describe again how cheating regarding the rule of law occurs. And this is a quote attributed to many: everything to my friends, the law to my enemies. And this is coming from Latin America, but it sounds familiar to many of you. And actually, an alternative version which predates this, this comes from the president, allegedly it comes from the president of Peru, Beneviste. But before that, it was a liberal Italian prime minister who said something very similar. And this is Giovanni Giolitti, who said that laws are applied to enemies, but only interpreted as regards friends. For those who forgot the name of Giolitti, he was instrumental in the coming to power of Mussolini. But he was a committed liberal. So I stop here because I think this story about Giolitti is frightening enough to make you interested in this book. And on that happy note, thank you again for being here, and particularly thank you very much for all those who took the effort to look into this book and formulate the views of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I kindly invite our next speaker? I understand that you would like to stand here.
Dear András, dear friends and colleagues, excellencies, all of you, either now or later. 30 years ago, I was here the last time, and nobody knew that Hungary would become the center of liberalism, or is it illiberalism? And I'm really honored to be back and to introduce my friend András's wonderful book. What I will try to do is I position it a little bit, and then at the very end, I will tell you, if you're in a hurry, which chapter you must read. If I'm not mistaken, the panorama stretching over the phenomena that might be characterized somewhat generously as corruptions or defects or deviances, decay, pathological symptoms of democracy and rule of law is theoretically uneven and conceptually colonized and demarcated by, in grosso modo, 3 camps. I'll introduce these 3 camps. All of them, in one way or other, addressing Hamilton's formula quoted with deep concern in the book by András. I quote, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. First camp. There are the authors who believe that we have to deal with forms, regimes, movements, structures, ideologies of authoritarianism. Since I'm a card-carrying member of this group, I believe I was invited today to this book launch. Another reason may be that András and I have been connected over the years, so this is Reconnect, by a culture of very friendly, intermittent discussion and dissent. Beginning with militant democracy, I hope you remember that, a wonderful conference actually here in Budapest. Second camp, there is still the rising stream of authors, assuming authors produce water or ideas that hold water, that are convinced populism is the philosopher's stone. The discourse on populism has been overflowing its banks for quite some time, especially the media have poured mostly murky water into its stream, but also political scientists and the political class who like, as we know, repetition. Third, compared with the populism crescendo, the last discourse to enter the stage comes across on the quiet. And it is of a more recent origin, illiberalism, also illiberal democracy, started with caution and Zacharias' article in 1997. It may very well gain momentum with a number of very recent publications. Thomas Main predicts the rise of illiberalism. The book will come out next year, and so do Koth and King. And then, of course, there will be the Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism forthcoming in the next year. And it's co-edited by Andras, Sajó, and it will contribute over 62 chapters to illiberalism, or rather to the discourse. Most importantly, ruling by cheating, the impressive study that brought us here will take or give more energy to this camp. I won't try the impossible, that is, defend the position and concept of authoritarianism in Budapest. So let me present the camps and the problems all of them are facing as they deal with the collective singular that relates to phenomena of ideology and social movements and regimes. All of them have a severe problem of definition, first, and of carving out their area of application, so they have a border problem. To start with populism, despite rich empirical studies, convincing systematic structuring, and enlightening ideas, populism is still, I think, a hopelessly indeterminate and overbroad concept. It is used to label right-wing, left-wing, and other democracy-enhancing and democracy obstructing movements, parties, regimes, and leaders. In the academic room of populism, we find peacefully assembled demagogues, despots, tyrants, racists, supremacists, ethnocentric leaders, xenophobic, misogynist, homophobic, as well as glib, popular, and very non-popular heads of state of government. Populism is used to characterize a style of mobilization targeting marginalized groups like the early Peron, early Chavez, Podemos in Spain, a strategy to gain power like the original People's or Populist Party in the United States, Le Pen's Rassemblement National, the AfD in Germany, Trump's first election campaign, etc. And also both the style and strategy may be geared toward stimulating discontent and resentment against elites, the system, the media, of course. Thereby invoking a collective identity, the authentic people. Finally, it is also used or introduced as a rhetoric and ideology, however thin. And all of the above at the same time, depending on the author and the study. To all of this, András and I might articulate or might criticize that there is a significant lack of constitutionalism or constitutional thinking in the camp of populism. In consequence, I'm tempted to bring up Klaus Offer's idea of a moratorium again. He raised it in early 1990s against the excessive use of civil disobedience. Civil society. I was really sad because I had just discovered civil society in my work. Hopeless, so I will not ask for a moratorium. All you academics, you can continue to talk about populism. Authoritarianism then. It has to cope with a tricky, more than conceptual relationship to authority, with its historical layers of meaning. And let me be brief, because this is the moment for ruling by cheating. In terms of power, authority is arguably based on a symmetrical relationship between rulers and ruled, leaders and followers. In contrast, authoritarian rules can be said to be identified by an asymmetry of power, an asymmetry of legitimacy. To quote Heinrich Heine, the devil is a devil because the people believe in him. And to quote Karl Marx, it's a beautiful quote in Das Kapital, one of the few sentences I really understood. The king is a king because other people behave towards him as subjects, and they are subjects because there is a king. It's very early in the Kapital, and so you don't have to read much, I think till page 72. Authoritarianism has to seek some conceptual and theoretical distance from its running mate, you could also say the running amok brother, totalitarianism, which to my surprise was also mentioned in passing in András's book. So looking at the intensified repressive technique may not be good enough to characterize authoritarianism. One could and has to add further characteristics. For instance, in the spirit of Hannah Arendt, a hermetic totalizing ideology, a practice of total terror, and a system driven by an enormous intentionality. This is, of course, of French origin. It's a little more difficult, but it's aimed at the phantasm of a gleichgeschaltete, uniform, homogeneous society. No pluralism of vision of the good life, no pluralism at all. That's sort of characteristic of totalitarianism. The last characteristic of authoritarianism could be that it sort of has certain ideological and programmatic ingredients like ethnocentrism, misogyny, etc. I will not go into that, but I will turn now to the last camp, which is illiberalism. It enters the stage at the beginning of the 21st century, if Zachariah forgives me, with publications mentioned above. Illiberalism is very often qualified also as illiberal democracy, and it echoes, in a way, Fukuyama's end of history. There's only liberalism and its deficient other, or its deficient progeny. The obvious problem of definition for the illiberals, I mean the academics, of course, how to disjoin the internally conjoined twins and keep illiberalism alive and freestanding, like Cain and Abel in the book of liberal Genesis. Very much like Cain, it is scrutinized through Abel's lens and regarded as a toxic political ideology. That is a quote from Thomas Paine. A democracy without civil liberties and the rule of law institutions and practices missing. A minority argues that illiberal democracy is an oxymoron. András will be the leader of this group. I'm not saying the pack, András. In his book, he struggles also, like me and others, with the problem of definition and of bordering regarding to the concept. But he provides a very interesting solution. Illiberalism, he argues, owes its existence to the abuse or misuse of democracy and the rule of law. It is listed in this book very, very thoughtfully and intensely. Authoritarian structures and values that assert themselves, like in elective democracies, problems Andras has always fought against with a vengeance. And there, a beautiful picture is, or metaphor is, that he speaks of Trojan horses of liberalism that smuggle religious values and imperatives into the secular liberal world and sequester the public sphere. Unlike Robespierre, Andras does not assess the people good and the magistrates bad. And he does not believe that constitutions and laws are basically and always good and ought to be observed. Instead, he argues more specifically, number one, that rules once laid down ought to be observed. And number two, if you want to change the rules, you should do so by following the rules almost like Herbert Marcuse in The One-Dimensional Man, who surprisingly to people who have read Marcuse at the end at one point says, a world of laws, we could also say the rule of law, may not be ideal, but is infinitely better than a lawless world. Number three, ruling by cheating may claim in the last chapter to have revealed the secret of illiberal democracy in the post-truth world. And I'm strongly convinced that Andras' heart of hearts of the title could have read in defense of the rule of law. You have to read the last chapter, obviously. His focus is directed less on participation and representation or communication, which I would argue that you have to talk about that if you talk about illiberal democracy. He severely criticizes those leaders, regimes, movements that pretend, quote, to observe a rule in order to depart from it and to reap undeserved benefits. His critiques focus more directly on the abuse and absence of the rule of law. I agree with him there. I would just say it's a strong argument for rule of law and not so much for liberalism. I guess that's where we have another of our friendly debates. So the last chapter, to really sell it to you, I think the last chapter is a chapter that he should have written 3 years ago, because it could have helped me to improve my study on between magic and deceit. It is a phenomenal phenomenology of cheating and deceit, something that really will needs to be read. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Frankenberg. And now we turn to Mr. Matlak.
Thank you very, very much for this invitation. I'm very happy that the Review of Democracy, which I'm representing, can take part in this debate, especially that illiberalism is one of our major field of interest. I have to admit that I feel a little bit like a little-known Eastern European music band performing after the Rolling Stones, but I try to do my best. I'm very happy to be here, of course, as we are discussing a great book, wonderfully written, rich and thought-provoking. Its most important added value in my understanding is the fact that you've shown, Professor Sajó, convincingly the illiberal elements in liberal democracies. You've shown, for example, that freedom of religion may help to survive such an illiberal institution as the Catholic Church, that the private property might strengthen illiberal hierarchies within liberal democracies. The elements of liberal democracies that we always taken for granted are much more complicated than we thought before. That's why I think that this is such an important book, and I think that we will have to really think through our vision of liberal democracy after reading this book. Your defense of the democratic character of illiberal regimes, or partial defense of this democratic character, is very thought-provoking, as I said, even if I'm still convinced that if the players are playing by different rules, the result can't really be called democratic. At the same time, it's true that we can't forget that very significant groups in our society support the illiberal regimes, as you convincingly show, and that illiberal regimes make intelligent use of the democratic institutions. And now I would have three remarks that are also questions to you, Professor Sajó. First, I would like to start from the citation, your citation of a piece by Graham Walker. And I will read that, and then I will read your answer to the question in this citation. How to constitute a non-tyrannical politics with a decent rule of law, while at the same time affirming in a public, institutionalized way a particular ethos, whether of nationality, moral solidarity, religious tradition, or some more or less alarming combination of all three. And your answer is, the answer seems to be no. A state that commits first and foremost to the protection of a specific major identity and accepts personal rule as the allegedly best protector of that identity inevitably moves away from constitutional neutrality. And of course, this is, if we speak of the Hungarian example, this is absolutely understandable, but it seems that this answer could be positive for other political ideologies. If we think of, for example, French republicanism with its understanding of, for example, what education is for and what secularism, or on the other hand, if we think of Christian democracy in the afterwar period, we can think of political ideologies that allow the constitutional democracy to work properly. That's why I wanted to ask if you are willing to answer to this question, not only taking into account what's happening in Hungary or Poland. And you've also shown that the problems related to the concept of the rule of law and the totalitarian aspect of within democracy, and that's the cornerstone of the book, which is very important to me. And here I wanted to ask you what would be the consequences of your intellectual work for the European project. Professor Wouters cited the Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. Of course, the EU in the last years developed or tried to develop a framework to defend the rule of law, probably without success, but still, this seems to be the key aspect of the European project in the last years. And if we accept your claim that the rule of law can be much more problematic concept. Shall we somehow revisit our thinking when we discuss the rule of law within the European Union? Shall we somehow change the concept or define it differently? What would be the consequences of this of your intellectual work for the European project, if I may ask so? And then the third area that I wanted to talk about is the question of the political transformation in Central and Eastern Europe. You wrote that and here I quote, mechanically copied constitutional arrangements which did not enable the long-term transformative effects that would firmly root basic tenets of constitutional decency into the uncontested shared cultural heritage. So it seems that there was something flawed in the political transformation of the Central Eastern European countries. So I would like to ask you what could have been done better here when it comes to I know that is a very big question, but I guess it's quite important. Now there are, as you are all aware, many discussions about political transformations. They are mostly concentrated, I think, on the economic aspects, and that this is the root of Eastern European populism. But here, I think it would be interesting to learn your thoughts about the Eastern European constitutionalism and its role in the rise of populism. Thank you very much.
The Baroness Smith of Newnham.
Whoops. Right, as the smallest person here, I'm not quite sure that I'm speaking into the microphone. Can I be heard at the back? Excellent, thank you. I'm here as a member of the Reconnect team, somebody that has had to be reconnected with Europe and who is delighted to be reconnected in particular with Budapest and the Central European University. When Jan contacted me about the Reconnect project, the United Kingdom was still part of the European Union. I'm a professor of European politics in Cambridge, and when we discussed what my title should be, I played around with British and European politics, but I didn't want to say British and European politics because I was very keen that it shouldn't look as if I thought that Britain wasn't part of Europe. And in the United Kingdom, particularly in Cambridge, there is a tendency, there always has been, to separate out Britain and Europe and assume that Britain isn't part of Europe. But when I first came to Budapest in 1995, the UK was fully part of the European Union and Hungary wasn't. I arrived on a very windy day in May 1995 and thought that it was the most wonderful city and I'd like to come back. And in 1997, I came back to teach at the Central European University. So I feel very much today that I am being reconnected with a very beautiful part of Europe, but it's one that has changed somewhat dramatically since that time. When I first came to Budapest, I was doing some work on political parties and in particular, the history of the Liberal International. The Liberal International had its Congress in, I think, 1991 in Budapest. And at the time, there were two very strong liberal parties in Hungary. SDS, the party of George Soros, very much an economic liberal, whose name has become in many places a byproduct or a byword for excessive capitalism, but who was a liberal and from a British perspective also very strongly pro-European. And the other party was Fidesz, at the time the party of young liberals. Hungary was seen as one of the countries that was at the avant-garde of the transformation from the communist world, admittedly with its goulash communism, to Western democracy human rights, and the rule of law. But one of the telling phrases that I was given in the mid-1990s was that in Hungary, there was a saying which went, "We pretend we're ready, and they pretend they want us." This isn't the we and them of ordinary populism. This we was Hungary, and they was the European Union. And the assumption in the mid-1990s was that the European Union said that it wanted to enlarge, that it wanted to bring in other countries, but that maybe it wasn't serious. And the Amsterdam negotiations of 1997, which failed to pave the way for enlargement, very much suggested that that Hungarian concern was right. The European Union maybe wasn't serious about enlargement at that time, beyond warm words. But what was being suggested from the Hungarian side was that for all the requirements that the European Union was putting forward, in particular the Copenhagen criteria, the Hungarians, the government, not the citizens, but the government and the negotiators were saying, yes, yes, we're doing what you want. We're going to meet those Copenhagen criteria. Now, some of you in this room weren't, I suspect, born when the Copenhagen criteria were laid out in 1993. They are essentially the ideas that Jan mentioned before, being in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. They relate to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, the issues that underpin the Reconnect project, but also are part of Professor Sajó's fascinating work on illiberal democracy. But the expectation for the European Union was that countries that aspired to EU membership would also not just aspire to being liberal democracies, but would actually transform themselves into fully functioning liberal democracies. It was at the time of Fukuyama and the end of history, there was an assumption that countries, Hungary, Poland, the Czech and Slovak republics, the Baltic states, were all seeking to join Western institutions, and an assumption by the European Union that we would be able to export, and I say we because I still feel myself to be a European citizen, even though I no longer have a formal EU citizenship. But we were trying to export norms and values that we said, this is absolutely the way we should govern. Liberal democracy is surely something that everyone should aspire to. And for a period, both the United States and the European Union assumed that we could export those values. And we assumed we could do so in a variety of ways. Some were sticks and some were carrots. USAID, the Republican and Democrat institutes went and gave funding in Latin America, some of the countries that Professor Sajó mentioned. In the 1990s, they were the very countries that academics were writing about transforming to being democracies. They were supported very much by the Americans, but also by German political foundations. The same then was true in Central and Eastern Europe, that the German party foundations, as well as the European Commission, assumed that we could ensure that countries transformed themselves to support and believe in the values that we all put forward. 30 years on, that no longer seems to be the case. But the irony is that a move towards illiberal democracy isn't just using the tools of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, in countries like Hungary, where Viktor Orban says, you talk about liberal democracy, I talk about illiberal democracy, and he talks about it as a badge of honor. Some of those populist tropes aren't just in countries that say, we no longer support your values. We've joined the European Union. Whether we lied or whether we genuinely thought we wanted to be liberal, but now we've decided we don't. They are also true in the United Kingdom and in the United States. The ideas of us and them aren't just populist tropes that are in countries that maybe are criticised for turning towards populism or illiberal democracy. They are far more widely prevalent. And so I think it is absolutely vital that we do all study far more about illiberal democracy. And I'm delighted that this book has been published. And although my reading list on European politics has just gone to the students already in Cambridge, my lecture on illiberal democracy isn't due till the end of term. So I shall be drawing very heavily on Professor Sajó's ideas. But I'm also slightly shocked and horrified to believe that there can be a handbook on illiberalism that runs to 66 chapters? 62 chapters, because that is really suggesting that the world is moving in a very clear direction away from liberal democracy. I am an unelected politician as a member of the House of Lords, so perhaps I shouldn't pay too much to the gallery of saying democracy and liberal democracy are vital. But I think they are. However, I think that if West Europeans and others in Europe and the United States believe in liberal democracy, we need to do a lot more to advertise why it matters in a way that's effective. Because as we are exhorted to note right at the opening of Professor Sajó's book, scholarly opinion in the US and Western Europe too often believed that illiberal darkness reigns only in faraway forests. It can't happen here. And he notes that the history of fascism shows otherwise. I don't want to suggest that we're in the shadow of fascism, but living in a country where a prime minister felt that he could prorogue parliament to try to get Brexit done, where he could stifle the voice of parliament, I think that the mother of parliaments, that parliament that had Gladstone as the person, Gladstone and Disraeli, the sort of people that Weber was looking to for plebiscitary leadership, we are all vulnerable to illiberal democracy. It's a risk to all of us. And we need not only to read Professor Sajó's book, we also need to understand how to reconnect better with all citizens so we can move forward in a democratic and liberal way and not fall foul and move towards illiberalism.
Thank you so much, Julie. And now we turn online to Dr. Taborowski. Are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you.
Can you unmute? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I put three points into the discussion, actually questions for Professor Sajó, I would like to say first that I feel very honored by the invitation to comment on Professor Sajó's book. I'm all the more pleased that our institution, the Polish Ombudsman, during the term of office of Professor Bodnar, awarded Professor Sajó a special prize for his services to the protection of human rights. At the ceremony, Professor Adam Bodnar, referring to Tolkien, emphasized that Professor Sajó is like Gandalf, the White Rider who changes the course of battles, and that the time will come when he will come with the help of liberal democracy at the head of the Rohirrim to win against the forces of evil. So perhaps this book is the first step in this direction. This book points out very important mechanisms of liberal democracy. It can be an important point of reference for those who want to realize these mechanisms, counteract them, and maybe protect themselves against such mechanisms now or in future. Emphasize that the everyday reality in Poland confirms many of the theses and mechanisms described in the book. First of all, there's one thing I have to say about the title of the book. The title in itself has an unambiguous translation to the Polish situation and is extremely apt. It is because of the lies that the Polish Prime Minister, Mr. Morawiecki, has earned the now universally recognized nickname Pinocchio, because he's known to lie regularly in his political narratives and is caught at it. I can give an example from the day today. there was, as you all know, a very important Court of Justice judgment concerning Judge Jurek, in which the Court of Justice basically ruled that a part of the judges of the Polish Supreme Court are not a court established by law, according to Article 19 of the Treaty on the European Union. And therefore, the rulings of such a court can be disregarded according to the principle of primacy of EU law. The Prime Minister of the Polish government said in this connection that Poland is a state of law based on the constitution on very clear rules. An attempt to strike at the very core, at the very heart of the stability of the social and legal system of Poland is an attempt to destabilize the system in a far-reaching way. That is something we cannot allow. The Justice Minister, meanwhile, added that the Court of Justice ruling violates European treaties. So the reverse logic, which is a kind of cheating, is in operation. The effect is being confused with the cause. So the statutory reforms on the judiciary are the cause for those rulings, and they cause the problem, and not the judgments of the Court of Justice, which invoke the existing European standards. Another kind of a current example that fulfills the constructs described in the book is yesterday's ruling of the Polish Constitutional Court, which was already mentioned here. Let me just remind you that yesterday there was a ruling on the principle of primacy of EU law, also, but not only, in the context of Court of Justice rulings on the principle of effective judicial protection. In fact, the case concerned regular laws which are contrary to EU law. However, the motion of the Polish Prime Minister, confirmed yesterday by the Court of Constitutional Tribunal, which, by the way, according to the zero-floor judgment of the Strasbourg Court, is also not a court established by law because there are judges, double judges sitting at the bench. The court has used the provisions of the constitution to give the ruling majority a launching pad to disobey Court of Justice rulings based on Article 19. To do so, an artificial conflict has been created on the line between EU law and the constitution. Moreover, we don't have the full judgment yet, but there was an oral explanation of the judgment yesterday. The judges said something like that they can actually review Court of Justice rulings, although the Constitution of Poland does not give them the competence to do so. They told us also that the Court of Justice is not an independent court because the judges of the Court of Justice have a renewable term of office and are appointed by the executive. They also said us that the principle of primacy was considered a new stage in the development of EU law, and therefore it violates community law. So as we see, as Professor Sajó writes, the Constitutional Tribunal, elected in the majority by the current ruling majority, has instrumentally used the constitution at the request of the government to block the adverse effects of international court rulings on the government. So the court is used to protect the order created by illiberalism and the actual interest of the regime. And the regime would like to profit now, like Professor Sajó writes also, from the rule of law, which sees the constitution as the supreme legal source in Poland and makes the judgments of the Constitutional Tribunal definitive, final, and binding. These are just two examples. I could name a lot more. And now the question arises on how this affects citizens, whether people are in principle completely indifferent to what is happening. As Professor Sajó writes on page 10 of his book, illiberal democracy is embedded in the ability of a centralized executive to dominate a society of dependent people. Also at the end of the book, he tells us that politics, or in politics, actually spin doctors are now key players. He tells us that many government actions, including laws, and as we can see also judicial proceedings, merely spin operations. So he tells us that we are living in a world of marketing mechanisms that have made citizens into passive recipients of content, including political content, and also content that touches their lives in important ways. So used or faced with such an approach, such techniques, most citizens will be vulnerable. I can confirm those observations also from the Polish situation. In my opinion, the book expresses and formulates thoughts and observations about which I was convinced, but could not name them or describe. Well, they are written down, described, and classified. They show the full picture, which contributes to the understanding of the situation. The book also shows how similar in effect, though sometimes different in means, are the mechanisms of overpowering constitutional orders in states, but also the very causes that constitute the ground for the growth of illiberal governments. Of course, I have followed the Polish examples used by the author with particular urgency. What is currently happening now influenced most of the mechanism and phenomena described as ruling by cheating. So the mechanisms of state capture, of the capture of the constitutional court, national courts, the offices of the state, and system of financing, independent entities or local governments, and many other situations mentioned in the book find a clear confirmation in the Polish situation. And now my three questions to Professor Sajó at the end. First of all, the qualification proposed by the author that illiberal democracy should not be labeled as a kind of authoritarian regime, but that is belong to the democratic family in the original Rousseauist understanding of democracy, has, of course, a scientific value. It can be a contribution to many discussions, but my question is, does this qualification have any practical value? Can such a qualification change something and have a bearing on political life or the narrative presented to voters? That would be my first question. My second question concerns, as Professor Sajó writes on page 285, that legislation often relies on political lies about real legislative intent. However, he also writes that once a court embarks on the review of the intent of legislation, it leaves the world of legal activities and thereby risks its own legitimacy. It will open itself to accusations of politicking. And now my questions. The Court of Justice examines intensively in recent case law concerning Poland the real aim of the legislator. We had, for example, the case concerning the Polish Supreme Court, where the Court of Justice said that the real aim of the legislator was to remove a certain group of judges from the Supreme Court of Poland. In another preliminary ruling concerning the judicial control of the nomination process for judges, the Court of Justice told us that the legislator had, for example, an aim to prevent the upholding of preliminary references to the Court of Justice, or he had a specific intention of preventing any possibility to exercise judicial review of appointments of the National Judicial Council in the new composition, appointment for judicial positions. My question to the author would be, does this, in the author's opinion, delegitimize the Court of Justice, or is there such a risk when the Court of Justice goes into this direction? And my final question concerns the concept of Doppelstaat. The author on page 322 explicitly rejects the Doppelstaat as something which could describe the described phenomena, the phenomena described in the book. In relation of to the Polish situation, there are works of Professor Ewa Łętowska or Professor Jerzy Zajadło, which tell us that what is happening in Poland resembles actually the Doppelstaat concept, because there is a drastic divergence between how it should be and how it is. And this as it should be is potential and abstract, and the as it is concrete and real. So we have an unamended constitution, which remains at odds with what emerges from the ordinary legislation and the practice of law application. So conceptually, the Doppelstaat refers to a more general phenomenon than the case Frankl describes. It is the descriptive phenomenon of the hypothetical duality of orders and the search for false legitimacy. So the question is whether it would not be possible to apply concept also to some countries such as Poland in terms of the way they operate. So not in terms of content, but in terms of this duality, which is a part of this concept. Because the explanation of rejecting the Doppelstaat is very short. I would, if it is possible, ask Professor Sajó to extend the idea that, or the explanation that we are not dealing here with the idea of Doppelstaat. That would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have had enough questions. We've had enough questions and comments for at least 20 different new PhD projects, but I kindly invite the author, Professor Sajó, for his right of reply, a brief right of reply, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these really helpful comments and encouragement coming from the comments. I don't want to start by saying that I will be brief, because you know when someone starts by saying that I will be brief, that means that you won't have coffee, because it eats into your break. So first of all, I think that the questions are absolutely relevant, and if you allow me, I would be more than happy to develop the ideas in an article in the journal. Secondly, just three specific remarks, so basically 3 paragraphs. The first is about the ethos that is needed for a constitutional system to operate. Yes, that's always a shortcoming of lawyers, that they tend to look into institutions, although institutions do have a spiritual dimension, and I try to catch it. But yes, it's true that without Democrats, there is no democracy. And by the way, that's a problem, as it was mentioned already. But I just had this immense pleasure to watch for 2 hours a debate between Mélenchon and Zemmour. So the left, the extreme left, extreme life, extreme for those who don't like, of course, otherwise they're okay, for those who support them. And we are talking about 10, 15% on each side of the French population. And what they said about the ethos was, and in that respect, there was unanimity that, okay, let's leave NATO, let's undo most of the European Union as it is. And instead of that, what? We should present France, the great country, as a cultural source of power, and whatever is to be changed is to enable France to dominate culturally. Now that is a form of ethos. Is this contributing to constitutional democracy? I leave it to you. But this is what keeps France to a very great extent together. And then if you have problems with France in terms of democratic practice, you may have some of those problems related exactly to that attitude, which keeps France together. The second remark, which I think is more interesting for the Reconnect project, there was a specific question about the Court of Justice. And I, as a former judge of a competing institution, I have to be somewhat reluctant, but now I'm a little bit more relieved or relaxed. I certainly wouldn't have said that 3 years ago. Well, I must say that from a strictly precedent-based legitimacy, the Court of Justice is doing something surprising. If you compare the total lack of looking at legislative aim 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, you will be surprised how far they went. And to many, this is a break in terms of what precedent would have required. If you consider the judgment regarding Hungarian judges, which was a major dismissal of judges, never restored, that was a tiny issue of age discrimination. And they never looked into legislative intent. So in the book, I admit, and there are even contemporary Supreme Court examples where a court exceptionally looks into legislative intent at this level. I don't mean ordinary interpretation, but these are constitutional interpretation of what the law is really about. It happens. I think it's a legitimate step, but it's an act of ultimate desperation. And that's how I read these recent developments in the European Court of Justice. It tells you a lot how serious the problem is, that they could not find any other more traditional ways of interpretation. And finally, you were kind enough to refer your days at Central European University, and I would like to end on a somewhat discomforting image that yes, here we had this great institution in Budapest. Now we are still in that building, but the institution itself is elsewhere. And I think that tells you a lot about how illiberal democracy takes over. The wars are still here. We are still here. Some of us, many of us have left already. And that tells you that where the wall remains and the spirit goes there, the semblance is just misleading. So in a way, we are all absent here.
Thank you so much for these wise words. And we are now at the end of this roundtable, and it's high time we invite the organizers for the concluding remarks of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for this panel. This is the end of our conference. And actually, we're still here a little bit. At least some of us are still here. Some institutions are here. We hope to fill the void that the Central European University left behind with the Democracy Institute. And this, or at least one way we want to fill it is with the Democracy Institute. And this conference was a way to show everybody, show the world, show ourselves what we can do and what we're planning to do. We had a great keynote speech. We had 3 book launch sessions for 4 books, all published by DI researchers. We had 4 panels on a variety of topics that are on our minds and that we're talking about. Really, the goal was to highlight our thinking and to showcase the ideas that we hope will show up here, to showcase the idea that we want to look at democracy from a really multidisciplinary point of view and approach it from a variety of angles and put it together, and to have lively dialogues and lively discussions here, trying not to replace the university that had to leave, but to fill these walls with meaning as a way to resist, as a way to persist, and as a way to keep the spirit alive. I'd like to thank the participants who managed to come and be here with us, the audience also, and the audience online as well. We actually had about 50 to 100 people in person and online combined for each session, and we had hundreds of people watching the Facebook videos, the videos that are on our Facebook page. We hope that this will grow. So we had quite a large audience. I also want to thank the organizers, and let me single out David Karas and Barbara Grabowska-Moroz, because They were the engines behind this conference. We couldn't have done it without them. Of course, they worked with the leaders of the work groups in the Democracy Institute, but their energy really helped get this conference going. And I also want to thank the people who supported this conference. Robert Németh, who is still out there trying to make sure that we're all that all the technology and the communication aspect of the conference work. You've seen the way we communicate with the world. This is all thanks to Robert. And Kinga Pál, who organized just about everything else. So we had a lot of support from people, and we're very grateful that this could not have happened without you. So I think we've made it known to the outside world that the Democracy Institute is here and exciting things are happening. This is the first of what we hope will be a series of conferences, a series of annual events, but there will be lots and lots of things happening in the meantime. So we hope to meet you as well as your friends and colleagues here soon, and we hope that you'll follow us on Facebook and on all the other types of social media that we're trying to have a presence in. So thank you very much. And let me just point out that even though it feels like this is it feels like we're not here, but we're still here. And it feels like this is the end, but it's not really the end, because there's an aspect of this. It's not the conference, but there's an really exciting workshop that's attached to this conference that's continuing now and that's happening now and starting soon, the Reconnect Workshop, which is in room 103. So I hope that you will all proceed there. So thank you again. Thank you for being here, and we hope to see you again.